Slavery is the treatment of human beings as property. It means taking away personal rights. This has happened in many forms all over the world. But one institution stands out. It stands out for how big it was all over the world. It also stands out for its lasting legacy. The numbers involved in the Atlantic slave trade are truly staggering. From 1500 to 1880 CE, somewhere between 10 and 12 million African slaves were taken by force from Africa to the Americas. About 15% of those people died during the journey. The majority of enslaved Africans were taken from 6 main regions. These regions were Senegambia, Sierra Leone, and the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa. West Central Africa is also known as Congo and Angola. An estimated 12.4 million people were put on slave ships. They were carried through what became known as the Middle Passage. This was the journey across the Atlantic Ocean. It included many different destinations. Once in the Americas, the surviving slaves were sold at a market. This was very similar to the way cattle would be sold. After purchase, slave owners would often brand their new possession on the cheeks. Again, just as they would do with cattle. The lives of slaves were ruled by work and terror. The idea was this: I'm not human, but I have no soul. I am a beast. Brand me, burn me, whatever. And there is no recourse. There is nothing. The history of humanity is filled with oppression, dominance, war, and slavery. Since the beginning of time, people in different parts of the world have forced their fellow humans into slavery. The tale of the Atlantic slave trade is the history of millions of Africans. They were forced out of their communities by European slave traders. They were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. The conditions were of great cruelty. When Portugal and Spain started conquering and making colonies in the New World in the early 1500s, they forcefully made the Indians work their plantations. However, European diseases and the violence of conquest led to the death of many of the Indian slaves. This led to a shortage of workers in the colonies. It made the Europeans look towards Africa for a solution. As voyages to Africa went on, and with many expeditions by Portuguese and Spanish explorers, Africa became a major source of supply of slaves. Slaves were sent to Europe and the Spanish West Indies. They were also sent to the Portuguese colonies in Brazil. The Indian slaves were slowly replaced by Africans. These Africans were stripped of their identity and their occupation. To refer to them as just slaves is incorrect. This is because before being captured by the Europeans, many of them were farmers, merchants, soldiers, musicians, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, and many more things. They were husbands, fathers, wives, children, and mothers. They had origins and heritage. But when the Europeans came and took over their communities, they became captives. They had to be put on large ships and taken away. The European slavers spread them out across the Americas and different parts of Europe. They were forced to lead lives under terrible conditions. They faced severe work conditions. They were stripped and whipped. They were forced to work very long hours. This was often under terrible weather and health conditions. The transatlantic slave trade moved between 10 million and 12 million enslaved black Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. You might have heard of the triangular trade, right? And how Africa was a major part of this trade. Africa suffered economically while the other two parts that made up the triangle enjoyed huge economic benefits. We will get to that shortly. The first slave voyage from Africa to the Americas is believed to have sailed in 1526. But even before this period, Africans were bought as slaves directly from Europe. Also, native inhabitants of America were enslaved by European explorers. Before 1518, the Spanish monarchy did not allow the transportation of African slaves from Africa. This was not because of a sense of moral value or humanity. It was because they believed Africans were barbaric. They believed Africans would corrupt European society. They thought Africans would introduce pagan and non-Christian practices to the country. However, over the years, because of economic reasons, there was a complete change in that decision. On August 18, 1518, King Charles V gave a charter to Lorenzo de Gouravad. This charter allowed him to transport 4,000 slaves directly from Africa to the Spanish-American colonies. Over time, King Charles changed the law made by his grandparents. He then permitted slaves to be brought into Spanish colonies in America from Africa. This was on the condition that they would be converted to Christianity during their voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. With this new decree in place, there was an explosion in the number of slaves moved from Africa to America. There was an immediate expansion of the slave trade in the Western Hemisphere. European slave traders gathered and imprisoned the enslaved at forts on the African coast. Then they brought them to the Americas. Generally, the European slave traders did not take part in the raids. This was because their life expectancy in sub-Saharan Africa was less than a year. This was due to the widespread malaria infection. So, the majority of people that were transported in the transatlantic slave trade were people from Central and West Africa. They were captured by other West Africans. Then they were sold to the Western European slave traders. The transatlantic slave trade was essential to the whole economics of the triangular trade route. European colonies in America needed the supply of slaves for their plantations. Speaking of essential, it is essential for you to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. They do not want us sharing stories like this, but we are going to continue anyway with your support. The triangular trade. Now, let us dive a little deeper into what the triangular trade route was all about. The triangular trade route is simply the trade structure that operated across the Atlantic region. This triangular trade route across the Atlantic took goods from Europe to Africa. Some of the goods taken to Africa include arms, textiles, and wine. On the other side of the triangle was the movement of African slaves to the Americas and the West Indies. The last side of the triangle was the movement of raw materials back to Europe. These raw materials were things like sugar, coffee, tobacco, rice, and cotton. They were produced on American plantations. The triangle involved 3 continents. Europe provided the capital. Africa provided the labor. America provided the land and the resources. There was always a supply to the European market. The story of the transatlantic slave trade involves the story of all people in the 3 continents. But most importantly, it involves those in the Middle Passage voyage. The trade route that transported slaves is known as the Middle Passage. The voyage is often marked with a lot of difficulties. There was even death. Depending on the weather, the voyage could take about 3 to 6 months. The passage was so brutal that the ships not only lost the people being transported as slaves. In some cases, the crew also lost their lives. The death rate for sailors on slave ships was approximately 20%. The ships had a particular design. They varied in size and in how many people they could carry. The conditions of these ships were inhuman. The African slaves were locked up below the deck in cramped quarters. They only had a little opportunity to be out in the sunlight. They were forced to carry out certain enforced exercises. These were in the form of dancing. This was to make sure that they were healthy and in good posture when they got to Europe. Inside of these decks was sticky. It was filled with the stench of dirt, body odors, and urine. Research published in 1794 estimated that a man inside the deck had just a space of 6 feet by 1 foot 4 inches. A woman had 5 feet by 1 foot 4 inches. The girls had 4 feet 6 inches by 1 foot. The air inside the deck was hot and stale. It was filled with the constant smell of dirt and human waste. The slaves suffered from starvation and thirst. They only had 24 ounces of water every day. That is the same as 2 12-ounce soda cans of fluid per day. Their major food was horse beans and rice. The captives were packed tightly in rows below decks. They were chained together hands and feet. The voyage was full of many difficulties. The captives faced issues that included epidemic diseases and attacks by pirates. They also experienced physical, sexual, and psychological abuse by slave traders and crewmen. An estimate by historians says that between 15 and 25% of the enslaved Africans bound for the Americas died during this voyage. The conditions were so severe that only a tiny percentage of the Africans transported in the enslaved trade came directly to North America. Just about 4% of the total Africans transported. Not more than 400,000 arrived in North America directly. A vast majority of the slaves were sent to the Caribbean and South America. Almost half of the slaves that were captured and transported out from Africa were sent to Brazil. This totals about 5 million. I know you will be wondering how thousands of slaves could not overpower hundreds of crewmen. Well, there was one popular situation where African slave trades revolted and took over their ships. The detail of this story is as chilling as it is fascinating. We will get to that shortly. But keep in mind that the slave traders were armed. They typically had the slaves in chains before transporting them. Anyway, let's finish up on the journey and the economics of the transatlantic slave trade. While we may think that all slaves transported out of Africa were through the transatlantic route, that is not entirely true. The transatlantic slave trade only made up for half of the total slaves traded and transported out of Africa. It is reported that from 650 AD to 1900, Islamic traders were also exporting slaves out of Africa. They sent out a total of 10 million slaves to Arabia, Yemen, Iran, India, and Iraq. The slaves were transported across the Sahara Desert, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean, while some slaves were also enslaved but remained in Africa. Many of the slaves captured and transported in the transatlantic slave trade were taken from the region bordering the Gulf of Guinea. The slave activities in this region were so excessive that the section of the African coast in countries like Togo, Benin, and Nigeria was even referred to as the Slave Coast. A majority of the slaves were taken from West Central Africa. In the early stages of the transatlantic slave trade, the Portuguese generally bought Africans who were captured as slaves during tribal wars. But as the demand for slaves increased, the Portuguese began to go into the interior of Africa to forcibly take captives. In the 1690s, the number of people taken out of Africa yearly reached about 30,000. A century later, the number grew to about 85,000 per year. During 1700 and 1850, it was estimated that more than 8 out of 10 Africans forced into the slave trade successfully crossed the Atlantic. In the period between 1821 and 1830, about 80,000 people were leaving Africa yearly. Within the next 20 years, before the abolition of slave trade, over 1 million more Africans were sent across the Atlantic to America. By 1820, almost 4 Africans for every 1 European had been transported across the Atlantic. 4 out of 5 women who crossed the Atlantic were from Africa. The majority of enslaved Africans brought to British North America arrived between 1720 and 1780. The Africans who were sent to Brazil were mostly from Angola. Those who were transported to North America, including the Caribbean, were taken mainly from West Africa. Although just about 6% of African captives were sent to British North America by 1825, the U.S. population included about 1/4 of the people of African descent in the Western Hemisphere. Interestingly, the condition of slavery in Latin America was totally different from that in the U.S. But before we delve into these mind-boggling details, let's talk about the revolt of 1839. Remember, I mentioned this earlier. In 1839, slave traders were once again hoping to get another shipment of slaves across the Atlantic. But unlike previous voyages, they were not ready for the surprise this particular voyage would bring their way. The slave ship named La Amistad had about 100 slaves on board. As the ship moved near the coast of Cuba, the unwilling passengers of the ship revolted. They had been recently taken from Africa. There were about 53 of them. They acted aggressively. The revolters were led by Joseph Sink. They killed the captain and the cook. They only spared the life of the Spanish navigator so that he could sail them home back to Sierra Leone. However, the navigator managed to sail the Amistad northward. 2 months later, the U.S. Navy intercepted and seized the ship off Long Island, New York. The ship was towed to New London, Connecticut. The mutineers were held in jail in New Haven, Connecticut. This event had big political and legal effects in the American abolition movement at that time. The Spanish embassy demanded that the African slaves be returned to Cuba. This led to the 1840 trial in the Hartford, Connecticut federal court. New England abolitionist Lewis Tappan was successful in getting public sympathy for the Africans. He was able to fight it with the pro-slavery U.S. government. However, the U.S. president at the time, Martin Van Buren, ordered a Navy ship sent to Connecticut. He He wanted to return the Africans to Cuba immediately after the trial. The interesting part of this was the legal proceeding that followed. The prosecutors argued that as slaves, the mutineers were subject to the laws governing conduct between slaves and their masters. And this is where it gets interesting. The trial testimony showed that while slavery was legal in Cuba, the importation of slaves from Africa was not. The judge therefore ruled that the Africans were not merchandise. They were victims of kidnapping, so they had the right to escape their captors in any way they could. When the U.S. government appealed the case before the U.S. Supreme Court the following year, former President John Quincy Adams was able to win the court ruling in favor of the Amistad rebels. The Supreme Court upheld the judgment of the lower court. Through contributions from private and missionary societies, the 35 surviving Africans got a passage home. They arrived in Sierra Leone in January 1842. They were with 5 missionaries and teachers. These people later founded a Christian mission in the country. While we could definitely blame the Europeans for the activities of the Atlantic slave trade, Africans were also involved in slave trade activities. Africans were involved in kidnapping adults and stealing children for the purpose of selling them. They used European intermediaries or agents to sell off these captives. They exchanged them for merchandise or arms. In most cases, those sold into slavery were usually from a different ethnic group than those who captured them. It did not matter if they were enemies or people from a neighboring village. The captive slaves were stripped of any identity they had. They were simply called other. They were not seen as part of the people of the ethnic group or tribe. Also, while African kings were very interested in protecting their own villages, in some instances, thieves and criminals were sold out into slavery. This was a way to get rid of them. Many other slaves were gotten through raids at gunpoint. These raids were organized by different ethnic groups. In some instances, it was a joint venture with the Europeans. Also recorded in the book Daughters of the Trade, Atlantic Slavers and Interracial Marriage on the Gold Coast, the author Pernille Ibsen shared that Africans on the Gold Coast, which is present-day Ghana, also took part in the slave trade through intermarriage. The term used was caçar. This gets its origins from Portuguese and means to marry. Caçar was used to form political bonds and economic connections between the slave traders and the Europeans. In the initial stages of the slave trade, it was common practice for powerful West African families to marry off their women to the European traders. This was for alliance and to further strengthen the business relationship. While the marriages had to be performed based on African customs, the Europeans offered no objection. They were fully aware of how vital these connections were to the success of their businesses. In the initial stages, we may argue that Africans had no idea of the exact condition of the slave trade. They did not know the experience of those sold into the slave trade. However, according to Robin Law, there is a possibility that the royal elites of the Dahomey Kingdom must have had an informed understanding of the fates of the Africans sold into slavery. This is because the king of Dahomey sent diplomats to Brazil and Portugal. They returned with information about their trips. Also, some of the elites of Dahomey had experienced slavery in America before returning home. So the only opposition the Kingdom of Dahomey had against slavery was the law that prohibited the enslavement of a fellow Dahomeyan. Anyone caught doing this faced the death penalty. And while the kingdom was against this, they had no issue with the institution of slavery itself. The case was different on the Gold Coast, which is present-day Ghana. Here, elites sent their kids to learn about the slave trade from the Europeans. They did this by sailing with them and living inside their forts. Some even sent their children to Europe and America to be educated. Elites on the Gold Coast also had agreements with the Dutch and British governments. These agreements were to rescue some of their friends who were tricked into slavery in America. However, a common assumption by many Africans was that the Europeans were cannibals. They were not aware of the true purpose of the Atlantic slave trade. They thought the Europeans planned on cooking and eating their captives. This rumor even made it more distressing for the captives who were locked in ships sailing to Europe. The transatlantic slave trade led to an uncountable loss of lives. This was for both captives in and outside America. A BBC report indicated that more than 1 million people are thought to have died during their transport to the New World. More died soon after their arrival. This was due to terrible health conditions. Although the number of slaves that died when bought as slaves is unclear, one thing we are sure of is that this number may exceed the number of those that survived to be enslaved. The Atlantic slave trade led to the destruction of lives and cultures. It is estimated that about 12 million slaves entered the Atlantic trade between the 16th and 19th centuries. About 1.5 million died on board slave ships. Apart from those who died in the Middle Passage, it is also estimated that many Africans were killed during the slave raids and wars in Africa. Canadian scholar Adam Jones has called the deaths of millions of Africans in this period a genocide. He referred to it as one of the worst holocausts in human history. Many believe that these deaths were not intentional. They think it was in the slave owner's interest to keep slaves alive and not kill them. Jones argues that the killing and destruction were intentional. Whatever the incentives to preserve survivors of the Atlantic Passage for labor exploitation, to revisit the issue of intent already touched on, if an institution is deliberately maintained and expanded by clear agents, though all are aware of the huge number of casualties it is inflicting on a definable human group, then why should this not qualify as genocide? Saidiya Hartman is an American writer and academic focusing on African American studies. She argues that the deaths of enslaved people were incidental to the acquisition of profit and the rise of capitalism. She argues that death was not a goal of its own. It was just a byproduct of commerce. This has the lasting effect of making all the millions of lives lost seem unimportant. Incidental death occurs when life has no normal value, when no humans are seen as involved, when the population is in effect seen as already dead. Saidiya Hartman goes on to say that although unlike the concentration camp or the Gulag, the Atlantic slave trade also led to millions of corpses. In this case, extermination was not the major goal. It was a major side effect of the making of commodities. Who do we blame? While we could blame the Germans for the genocide attempt on the Jews, who do we blame for this slave trade? 7 nations were actively involved in the activities of the slave trade. They took most of the slaves to their colonies in the New World. We have the Portuguese, the British, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, the Americans, and the Danish. The major sources of slaves include Angola, coast of Benin, Bight of Biafra, Gold Coast, Senegambia, Southeast Africa and Indian Ocean Islands, Sierra Leone, and Windward Coast. The presence of European slavers also affected how the legal code in Africa worked. According to Kamari Maxine Clark, many African societies changed the punishment for certain crimes. They changed the way they responded to certain offenders. Some crimes, which were traditionally punishable by some other form of punishment, became punishable by enslavement. Offenders were now sold to slave traders. David Stannard, the author of American Holocaust, showed in his book that 50% of African deaths occurred in Africa. This was as a result of wars between native kingdoms. These wars produced the majority of slaves. The practice of enslaving enemy fighters and their villages was widely practiced in West Africa. Indeed, the slave trade was largely a byproduct of tribal and state warfare. By selling off captives, they were also able to pay for future warfare. They could also remove potential dissidents after victory. However, some of the African nations were more brutal in this practice. These nations included Igala, Kabu, Bono State, Oyo, Ashanti, Dahomey, and the Aro Confederacy. Truly, Africans were fully involved in the slave trade. They even helped it in many ways. But we cannot take away the fact that the Europeans provided the incentives that made this activity grow. In one of the letters written by Manicongo, King Nzinga Mbemba Afonso, to King João III of Portugal, he writes to the king. He requests that the king stop sending merchandise that is fueling the war between the different tribes. He begs the king to stop sending merchandise. He asks the king to rather send more missionaries. In one of his letters, he writes, "Each day the traders are kidnapping our people. They take children of this country, sons of our nobles and vassals, even people of our own family. This corruption and depravity are so widespread that our land is entirely depopulated. We need in this kingdom only priests and school teachers. We need no merchandise unless it is wine and flour from Massachusetts. It is our wish that this kingdom is not a place for the trade or transport of slaves. Many of our subjects eagerly want Portuguese merchandise that your subjects have brought into our domains. To satisfy this strong appetite, they seize many of our black free subjects. They sell them after having taken these prisoners to the coast secretly or at night. As soon as the captives are in the hands of white men, they are branded with a red-hot iron. Despite the vast consequences of the transatlantic slave trade, there have been worldwide apologies from different nations. These nations benefited and grew their economy based on labor from the slave trade. In 1998, UNESCO named August 23rd as International Day for the remembrance of the slave trade and its abolition. This led to several other events that recognized the bad effects of slavery on the African continent. In 2001, during the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, African nations demanded a clear apology for slavery from the former slave trading countries. Some nations were ready to express an apology. However, the opposing countries blocked any attempt to do so. These countries were mainly the United Kingdom, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States. The reason for this opposition by these countries could be due to concerns. They were concerned that accepting their involvement in slavery would also require that they pay money to the affected African nations. Since 2009, there's been a continuous effort by the UN to create the UN Slavery Memorial. This would be a permanent remembrance of the victims of the Atlantic slave trade. This video was intense. But if you want to learn some more Black history that they never taught us in school, click the link on the screen. It is a story I'm sure you do not want to miss. We will see you over there. Please subscribe, like, and a beautiful comment.